The Mauler of Rajnagara. The Mauler is altogether an unusual tiger, in that his habits are very un-tigerish, and his haunts are in areas where no tiger has been heard of for many years. His habits are un-tigerish in that, the earlier records of his activities were entirely confined to mauling men by scratching them with his forefeet. There were 33 instances of such attacks by this tiger, his victims being mainly herdsmen. In not a single case did he either bite or kill his victim. In every case he severely scratched the man from the crown of his head, down his face and neck, and across his chest and back. This conduct at first led me to think that the so-called tiger was really a panther after all. But when at a later stage one questioned several of his victims, every one of them affirmed that it was a tiger and not a panther that had attacked him. I was also led to think that the animal had been wounded or otherwise injured in some part of its jaw, mouth, or face, so that he could not drive home his attack by biting his victim. This theory was entirely refuted by the herdsman, who stated that during 2 years, the same tiger had killed and eaten over 200 of their cattle. They had examined many of these kills after the event, and in no case was any evidence found that the tiger had been unable to use his teeth properly. He had not only killed his prey in regular tiger fashion by breaking its neck, but had eaten each animal in a very normal and thorough manner. The next strange thing about this animal was that he had begun his depredations in a most un-tigerish stretch of the forest, consisting of low scrub and thorn, very rocky, undulating hillocks with occasional steep boulder-strewn rivulets between them, flanked by long grass and occasional clumps of bamboo. It was known that panthers frequently roamed this area, and had even been seen on the main road that ran through it, but a tiger was unknown to the existing generation. This stretch of forest lies immediately to the south of the Dimbum escarpment in the district of North Coimbatore. A sharp drop of over 2,500 feet from Dimbum brings you to this region of arid scrubland, dotted with frequent palm trees, and consisting mostly of thorny bushes and lantana shrub. Other game is also scarce, being confined to a few peafowl and an occasional jungle sheep. The area is comparatively small, being about 5 miles from north to south, and about 30 miles from east to west, where it adjoins the Bhavani River, which eventually flows into the River Kaveri. We are told that this tiger had originally come from the Nilgiri jungles, had wandered down to the Moyar River and then taken its abode in this region. Its fondness for this locality can otherwise be well understood, for it is an area scattered with small cattle patties, and entirely devoted to grazing hundreds of cattle. Hence, what it lacks in natural wild game is more than balanced by the large number of domestic animals, which are much easier prey to any tiger. The story goes that at the earlier stages the tiger killed normally, ate his kills normally, and decamped normally when he was shooed off his kills by enraged herdsmen. But, as the old proverb says, too much of anything is good for nothing. Or, at least, this tiger seemed to think so. The herdsmen evidently made themselves too much of a nuisance to him, when too frequently they drove him off his kills. The first attack, as is usually the case, was made on a herdsboy who had had the temerity to throw a stone at him, just as he was in the act of dragging away a fine fat cow he had killed. The stone is reported to have struck the tiger's flank. The tiger is reported to have dropped the cow and charged the boy, whom he severely scratched about the face and chest. Then he went back and carried off the cow, which he thereafter ate in peace. On several later occasions herdsmen and boys tried to drive him off the beasts he had killed, or was in the act of carrying off, or was actually eating. In each case the tiger attacked and scratched the intruder. Naturally, as such attacks multiplied, he was left more and more alone. He was evidently a very wise tiger and had arrived at the sensible conclusion that it paid him high dividends to scratch but not to kill the intruders, for they thereafter left him more and more to devour his kill untroubled. And so time dragged on. Nearly 2 years had passed and the victims of his scratching rose to 33. Of these 11 died of subsequent blood poisoning, arising from the putrid matter in the tiger's claws. But these deaths, of course, may not be regarded as intentionally caused by the tiger himself. They were only an indirect consequence of the attack. And then, in July 1955, the first human being failed to return. It was known that he had been attacked by the tiger, for his screams for help had conveyed this information to another herdsman, who had been standing near. This individual, very naturally, had run away. In the earlier instances, the victims had generally managed to stagger back to the main road or to the cattle village, whichever happened to be nearer. But this victim did not return. Some 2 hours later, a search party set out to look for him. They came to the spot where the attack had been made. This time they found the dead cow, but they did not find the herdsman. The party lacked the courage to follow up any further, and the herdsman was never seen again. A half-dozen more attacks were made, in 3 of which the victims turned up as usual, badly scratched. But the remaining 3 did not, nor were they ever seen again. So the official score, at the time my story really starts, amounted to 4 killings and 36 maulings, the mauling, in every case, only by scratching. Whether the tiger actually ate these 4 men it had presumably killed, or only dragged them off to some remote part of the jungle, where they had been later devoured by jackals, hyenas and vultures, there was no means of knowing. I had read, now and then in the papers, of this animal's doings, but had no details until an official report reached me from the forest authorities. Also at about this time I had a few days leave to my credit and thought it would be best spent in seeing if I could catch up with this tiger. The forest map I possessed, together with the information received, indicated that the best place at which to make my headquarters would be the small village of Rajnagara, where there was a little forest shoe tree that would give me and my belongings shelter. This place, via Dimbam, is exactly 147 miles from Bangalore, and the road being quite good, I reached it in my Studebaker in just over 4 hours' time, at about 4 in the evening. I had no idea that an exciting time was ahead of me, for I was only 2 miles from Rajnagara itself, and was driving along the road through the arid scrub area, when I saw 3 men in front of me, one of them being supported by the other 2. As I drew abreast of them, I saw that the man in the middle was covered with blood. Stopping to inquire the reason, I was told that only a few minutes earlier he had been attacked and severely scratched by this strange tiger. Closer questioning elicited the fact that the tiger had attacked him after creeping up on him by stealth. The victim told me that, before he knew he was in any danger, he had heard a low growl. Then the tiger appeared beside him, reared up on its hind feet and scratched him severely about his face and chest. He had fallen down with the tiger on top of him, and had shouted for help. The tiger then left him and charged the cattle, which were milling around. As he lay bleeding on the ground, he had seen the tiger kill a half-grown brown bullock, which it had then dragged away. As nobody had come to his assistance, he had struggled to his feet and stumbled towards the road, still shouting for help. His 2 companions had joined him a little later. I regarded the opportunity as godsend, to be followed up at once, and asked him to tell his companions the exact locality where the attack had taken place. He did so, and I then asked for one of the men to accompany me to the spot, while the other went on to Rajnagara with the victim. A heated altercation now took place between them, both pleading urgent business at the village. It was clearly apparent that neither wanted to expose himself to the risk of meeting the tiger. For this I could hardly blame them, as the animal had already established his ferocity, while I was a complete stranger to them. They had absolutely no guarantee that I would not run away when the tiger showed up, and leave my companion in its clutches. By much pleading, coercion and even threats, I eventually induced one of the men, very reluctantly, to agree to come with me, while the other continued with the wounded man. My companion and myself then left the road and walked into the jungle. All along the path we came on splashes of blood from the recently wounded man. In crossing a bare stretch of rock these were plentiful, causing me to realize that he had been more severely hurt than I had actually noticed during my hurried conversation. I began to think that I should have taken him in my car to Satyamangalam, where there was a hospital, rather than leave the poor fellow to get there as best he could. Against this admitted negligence on my part, however, was the fact that I had a unique opportunity to meet this tiger face to face and settle the score once and for all. A little later we came to the spot where the tiger had attacked the man. The sand on the trail clearly told its own story. We began to look around for the place where the tiger had killed the brown bullock, and soon found it some 30 yards away. My companion now refused to go any further, nor did I want him to, as he was understandably in a state of abject fear and would be much more a liability than an asset. So I left him standing nervously and began to follow the drag mark clearly made by the tiger as he had hauled the brown bull downhill towards the ravine that lay between the hillock down which I was creeping, and another and much higher hillock a quarter of a mile away. Unfortunately, I had not anticipated such early action, and was wearing ordinary leather shoes instead of the rubber-soled boots I favored for stalking. Try as I would, these shoes made some noise on the hard ground and the rocky boulders that were scattered there. Nevertheless, I proceeded as silently as I could, till I had almost reached the nullah. Then I stopped and gazed about me. The scrub just here was very thick, and grew thicker where the rivulet was actually winding. My eyes roved over the slopes of the opposite hillock, which were fairly open. No signs of the tiger or the bullock were visible, and it was obvious that he must have hidden it somewhere in the nullah, and most probably would be eating it at that very moment. Even if he was not actually eating it, he would certainly be lying somewhere in the vicinity. My shoes put me at a distinct disadvantage, and would betray my further progress towards that nullah. If I removed them and attempted to advance in my stockinged feet, I was almost certain to step on a thorn, not to speak of the sharp stones that lay everywhere. At the same time, I realized the opportunity was too good to be lost, and should be pressed home somehow. It was a chance in 1,000, which I might never get again. The time was just 5 p.m., and there was an hour and a half before sunset. While I stood debating the odds, the tiger made the first move. He had quite obviously heard me. Probably he had seen me too. Anyhow, he had, after the manner of a great general, decided to make a flank attack. Quite unsuspected by me, he had already crept up the very slope down which I was moving, but at a slightly different angle, which brought him above and behind the spot where I stood thinking. Then he had evidently crept on his belly towards me, and was hiding behind a large bush, scarcely 10 feet away, all unknown to me. In this particular case, my sixth sense of impending peril quite failed to register. I had just decided to advance towards the nullah, when there was a shattering roar behind me, and the tiger sprang out. I spun around and fired at point-blank range, missing him completely. Probably the noise of the explosion, perhaps the strangeness of meeting someone who was obviously not a herdsman, or maybe rather the loud scarlet and blue check bush coat I happened to be wearing, scared him off. For with a series of loud woofs he bounded into the thicket and towards the nullah. I followed as fast as I could, reaching the bed of the nullah, where I almost fell over the brown bull. Examination showed that the tiger had already begun his meal before he had heard or sensed my approach, and had come forward on his own to the attack. There were no trees in the vicinity, so I sat under the thick bush till it began to grow dark, hoping against hope that the tiger might put in a second appearance. But this he did not do, and at 1:15 I cautiously retraced my steps the way I had come. Reaching the place where I left the herdsman who had accompanied me, I found him missing and concluded he had gone home. So I went on to the road where my Studebaker stood, and shortly after reached Rajnagara. Here a considerable crowd had gathered, and from a forest guard who was among them I found that the wounded herdsman had already proceeded to Sachimangalam hospital, together with his wife and brother. The herdsman who had accompanied me, whom I had left standing at the spot where the tiger had made his attack, while I had followed up the drag mark alone, had failed to return. I knew that he had not been at the place where I had left him, also that the tiger had run away after I had missed it. Where had the herdsman gone? We all realized that he would not remain in the jungle, or on the road, in a vicinity haunted by this tiger. What had become of him? I pondered this question, while his wife and family, who were also among the crowd and had overheard my inquiries, began to weep and wail. It was now quite dark, and to search for the missing man would be impossible, as no traces would be visible had the tiger taken him away. Nevertheless, calling the forest guard to accompany me, I drove back to the spot where I had earlier left the car. Here we halted for a while, and I instructed the guard to call the man by name. This produced no results. We drove a further mile along the road and then returned to the village. By now it was evident to me that my companion of the evening before had been taken by the tiger. Evidently, while I had spent an hour sitting in the nullah, watching for the tiger to return to the carcass of the brown bull, the tiger had done some hunting on his own, and had carried off the unfortunate herdsman. We did not get much sleep that night, having to listen to the weeping and wailing of the man's family, who squatted at the door of the forest shoe tree and amidst tears, reminded me that I was responsible for his death. This though impinged itself on my conscience very forcibly, for had I not almost forced the poor man to accompany me, he would have been alive at that moment. Early dawn found me retracing my steps to the spot where I had left him. Reaching it, I began looking around for any signs of struggle or other marks of the tiger's attack. Absolutely nothing was visible on the hard ground. In the course of my search I walked around in ever-widening circles, but still could find nothing. What had become of him was a mystery. I knew he had not followed me while I had pursued the tiger the previous evening. It was more likely that, being afraid of standing alone, he had begun to walk back towards the road. Working on this theory, I now turned back and slowly retraced my steps, looking around for possible traces. About 300 yards from where I had left him I found the first evidence in the form of an odd leather sandal, and not far away its fellow. At this spot short dry grass covered the ground and so no footprints were visible. But the position of the sandals made it clear to me that he had kicked him off, obviously in order to run faster. Searching around as I walked, I then saw something white flapping in the breeze under a bush to my left. It was the man's loincloth in India known as a dhoti. On the grass, and sprinkled on the bushes, were tiny splashes of blood, while closer inspection showed where the tiger had dashed through the undergrowth and caught up with its victim. From here the tiger had dragged the man in a course almost parallel with the road, towards the same nullah in which I had been sitting all the while the evening before, but considerably further down from where he had hidden the brown bull. I must have walked a quarter of a mile before eventually stepping on to the rocky bed of this rivulet. Nothing was to be seen, and here was complete silence. I knew the tiger must have hidden the remains somewhere in the vicinity. While watching quietly, a couple of magpies attracted my attention from a spot about 100 yards downstream. They were perched on the top of a thorny babel tree, where they were jabbering excitedly, frequently looking downward. The signs of the jungle are very clear to those who can read them. The magpies had either found the body, or were looking at the tiger, who in turn was probably looking at me. Keeping to the center of the nullah, I began to tiptoe forward, the rubber boots I was wearing this time making no noise against the rocks. Halfway to the babel tree, the magpies saw me, ceased their jabbering and flew off. I had marked the spot where they had been perched, and approached cautiously. Immediately below the babel tree, a small elongated black rock jutted from the bank onto the bed of the stream, and lying behind this rock were the half-eaten remains of poor Muniappa, the missing man. Soft sand at the spot also revealed the tiger's pug marks, and a cursory examination of them showed that the animal was a male tiger of no great size or build. Once again, there was no tree in the vicinity on which I could sit, except the aforementioned babel, which was unusable because of its thorny nature. Nor, as it happened, were there any large bushes or bamboo clumps under which I could shelter. In every way the spot was about the most unfavorable, if not impossible, one for sitting up, that I had ever encountered. Still, I would have to do something about it, for by this time there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that I was, at least indirectly, possibly directly, the cause of poor Muniappa's death. I knew the tiger was not likely to return to his meal until the afternoon at the earliest. If I left the body as it was, the vultures would see it within a couple of hours and pick it clean. So I removed the khaki coat I was wearing and spread it over the corpse, weighing it down here and there with small boulders that lay at hand. Then I went back to the car and returned to Rajnagara. Here I was forced to give the bad news, which not only led to renewed wailing, but a demand from the bereaved wife that the body of her husband be brought back at once for cremation. It took us a full hour to persuade her to give me a chance, that evening, for a shot at the tiger by sitting over the body, a chance which would be entirely lost if she had her way. Eventually, she very grudgingly assented. After breakfast, I called a council of war, which consisted of the village patel, the forest guard and myself. Explaining to them the position in which I had left the body, I told them that I would return to it at noon and sit beside the body to wait the tiger's return. They thought this was a foolish idea, and I heartily concurred. But as nobody could suggest a better one, there was no alternative but to carry it out, other than to bring the remains back to the village and thereby lose a possible shot at the tiger. Shortly after midday found me seated a few yards from the cadaver, from which a distinctly unpleasant odor was now rising. In fact, millions of bluebottles had already settled on my coat, and as soon as I removed it they swarmed over the remains. I was prepared for the unpleasant situation, having plugged small wads of cotton wool into my nostrils. But despite these measures, that awful stench penetrated my defenses, and in time I began to feel sick. The heat was terrible. The silence was absolute, except for the chirruping of the cicadas from the branches of the surrounding bushes. 3 o'clock passed, then 4 and then 5. At 5:30 a peacock flapped down to the stream. As I sat motionless he had not even noticed me, which goes to confirm how invaluable absolute stillness is when out in a forest. He walked up the bed and only when 10 feet away did he become aware of the two strange objects before him. He rose into the air, hurriedly and heavily, with a tremendous beating of his wings to gain momentum before he was able to fly away. As may be imagined, I was by this time in a state of great excitement, and even greater fear, and I was, besides, on the verge of retching from the awful stench that rose from the half-eaten man. Then followed complete silence for 15 minutes, a silence that was all-pervading, that envelops one, that is everywhere, even in the very air. There was not even the creak of the wood cricket, nor the twitter of the tiniest bird, nor even the faintest rustle of a dry leaf falling to the ground. Only a total and absolute stillness. That is what silence feels like, when one sits waiting for a man-eater to appear. Although I was sitting perfectly motionless, my eyes minutely searched the scrub before me and on either side. All my senses were fully and painfully alert, but no sight nor sound registered on them. The cheery evening crow of a jungle cock, a little further up the nullah, relieved the tension. 6 o'clock came, and then 6:15. An early nightjar began his peculiar clucking call. I knew that the time had come for me to leave. In a short while it would be completely dark, and then to sit for the man-eater in the open would be suicide indeed. Getting stiffly to my feet, I walked back to the car, where I had previously arranged for a party of men to meet me and bring back the remains of the unfortunate Muniappa. It was quite dark by the time I collected them, but I knew my torchlight and their numbers would render us immune from any attack by the tiger. We returned to the ravine, where we gathered up all that remained of the unlucky herdsman in an old blanket which the men had brought with them for the purpose. Then, while the little procession wended its way towards Rajnagara, I motored back along the road. Early next day found me again prowling about near the little nullah. The tiger had not returned to the spot where the body had been, as I could see by the absence of tracks. I then decided to walk along the bed of this stream towards the place where the brown bull had been left 2 days previously. I did this very cautiously, as the stream bed narrowed in places to hardly more than 6 feet and at points was nothing more than a pile of boulders or was entirely overgrown with lantana shrub. The brown bull had been hidden more than half a mile from where the man had been eaten. It had been hidden well beneath an overhanging bush I knew was safe from vultures. But when I reached it, it was only to find that the tiger had returned during the night and demolished it completely. Perhaps he had lost interest in his human kill or may have seen me earlier in the evening, sitting beside it, and become suspicious. Anyhow, the fact was that no kill remained and I would have to try other means of meeting the tiger. Up till noon that day, and again in the evening I roamed about over hillocks and through valleys, across other streams and along their beds. Many times I came across the tracks of the tiger, but never once did I see him, nor catch any sign of his presence in the vicinity. I spent 3 days in this fashion, but with entirely negative results. I had taken only a week's leave and had scarcely 4 days left in which to shoot the tiger. Next morning I adopted fresh tactics. Climbing to the top of a large hillock in the center of the terrain, I called as loudly as possible, in tiger fashion. Every 10 minutes or so I repeated the call, hoping to hear an answer. 2 hours later I did the same thing on a neighboring hill. No sound came in reply. In the evening I followed the same plan, and yet the tiger did not respond. It was clear by this time that he was not in the immediate vicinity. On the 5th day the herdsmen went out again with their cattle. You, who read this, may consider it a very brave thing on their part, and doubtless it was. But you must also realize the cattle were dependent for their food entirely on grazing. No grazing meant no food, for no provision had been made in any of the cattle villages for a reserve of fodder. That morning, I joined the herdsmen and wandered amongst their animals, doing the same thing in the evening. But night fell without any sign of the tiger. The 6th morning found me very despondent, as I felt the animal I was after had moved away and would not give me a second chance to bag him. But there was nothing more I could do, beyond mixing with the various herds of cattle as they grazed in the area. I covered a number of miles that morning and was about 8 miles from the place where Muniappa had been killed when, at about noon, a group of men came running through the shrub to tell me that another herdsman had been attacked 3 miles away. I hurried with them to where the man was lying. I saw once more the familiar signs: severe scratches across face, chest and sides, but no bite whatever. This man had lost a good deal of blood and was too weak to walk, so I hurried back to my car, instructing the men to carry him to the road. From there I took him to Satyamangalam, where I left him in the local hospital in pretty bad shape. Then I dashed back to the spot on the road to which he had been carried, left the car and went back into the jungle. There was no difficulty in following the copious blood trail he had left behind him, and this led me to the site of the attack. In this case I discovered that the tiger had not succeeded in killing any of the cattle, which had escaped by stampeding en masse to the road. So searching for the tiger seemed again a hopeless undertaking. I wandered around, and every now and again called in tiger fashion, hoping to attract him. There was no response, and so ended another day. That night I thought of motoring up and down the road that led through the shrub for about 5 miles, using my spotlight in the hope of picking up the tiger's eyes, should he be passing anywhere within range. I began to put this plan into practice at about 10 p.m., driving slowly, allowing for a stop of 15 minutes at the end of each trip. 6 hours of this monotonous procedure found me desperately sleepy and with a very low petrol tank. Thus dawned the 7th and last day of my leave. After the latest attack, the herdsmen had not turned out with their cattle, so for the last time I wandered alone through the scrub, hoping to meet the elusive tiger. Noon found me about 6 miles from my car, when I turned and began to retrace steps. I was walking down hillock and just reached the small depression at the foot of it. Before me another hillock rose. No stream traversed this valley, which was dotted with a few stunted babel trees, growing amidst the usual lantana and other shrubs. Hardly 50 yards ahead, the tiger stalked out. We saw each other at the same moment, and then, with a short bound, he disappeared behind a lantana clump. Raising the rifle to my shoulder I advanced slowly, expecting, and even hoping, for a charge that would bring him to my sights. At the same time I was mortally afraid, and my heart beat a loud tattoo. The charge never came. A sixth sense appeared to have told him that here was no victim, but one who was deliberately out to destroy him. He must have slipped away before I drew level with the bush behind which he had disappeared, for he most certainly was not there. I walked around it and searched everywhere, but I never saw him again. Thus ended my 7th and last day. The time had now come for me to return to Bangalore and duty. Although this is the story of an unsuccessful hunt, indeed, a story of complete failure, I have told it so that the reader may realize that such adventures are not always crowned with success. Failure and disappointment are far more frequent. But the hard work, strenuous effort, the very thrill of the chase, the pitting of human brains against animal instinct, all these factors are there, and to a considerable extent compensate the enthusiast for his failure. For although I was really sorry that I had to leave the herdsman, at least for some time, to the continued ravages of this animal, I felt satisfied that I had done my best, and I looked forward to returning, when I might meet with better luck. I handed a check to Muniappa's widow and started on that 5-mile stretch of road on the beginning of my return journey to Bangalore. As the thorn bushes flashed past the car, I bade a temporary farewell to that extremely cunning and quite extraordinary tiger, which had not only succeeded in outwitting me at every encounter, but had also successfully hidden the reason for his peculiar habit of only scratching and not biting his victims, except those he actually killed.